Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 468. All right, guys, welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise awareness of trauma and to support new trauma therapists just starting out on their trauma-informed journey. I do that through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. If you're a therapist of any kind, interested in learning about trauma, and you're looking for support and inspiration, I invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 by going to traumatherapist2.com. That's traumatherapist, the number 2.com. All right, let's get started. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am back again with Cissy White. Cissy, welcome back.
Nice to be here.
So Cissy, as you recall, is a trauma mama, writer, and joy-stalking survivor. She believes it's possible but difficult to live, love, and parent well while post-traumatically stressed. Her goal is to make talk about trauma and healing less clinical and more conversational, less abstract and more accessible. She's currently working at the ACEs Connection as a Northeast community facilitator and parenting with ACEs community manager. She believes the trauma-informed movement must be survivor-led. So, welcome.
Thank you.
So, like I said last time, I wanted to invite you back because I loved your energy. I love your messaging. And I want to be a part of what you're doing. And I want to bring you in to share what you're doing with my listeners, because I feel what you're saying is important. As I indicated on our initial interview, I think I first came across you on Twitter, and you were sharing, there was an immediacy about what you were sharing. And you're going through cancer as well. And there was something about what you're doing and getting your voice out there that just seemed like it needs to get out there. And I wanted to hear it and share it. So anyway, welcome.
Well, thank you. And there is urgency, even, with whether it's post-traumatic stress or whether you're dealing with cancer, like these are urgent in terms of life quality. Right. And it is urgent. And so I do feel really passionate and really willing to be open because, I love podcasts and social media because before this forum, we wouldn't, as a therapist and identified survivor, we wouldn't in many places be peers, just having a conversation. And I love that happens now because I think it's good for anyone impacted by trauma, whether personally or as a professional. Like how we treat trauma as a culture is a bigger conversation than how we treat it as a diagnosis. And I think if we have more conversations that are between us as people, as parents, as professionals, as patients in all those different realms, because we're all those things, it's better for all of us. That is really my perspective. And I don't think we've had, until social media, as many places where we're all coming from where we're coming when it comes to trauma and meeting and being able to intersect. It has mostly been in the past, a clinical conversation when it comes to trauma. And I think that's really, really broadening and in really exciting ways.
Let me just pause here. And I want to see if we can get your voice louder.
Okay.
Does that mean getting closer to the microphone or?
Let me put the microphone. I can do the volume and then I can also get closer.
That's better. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just want to make a note that I'll just edit there. That's fine. This idea of a distinction between PTSD as a diagnosis and how we talk about it as a diagnosis and how we talk about it as a culture is very, say more. What do you mean?
I just mean like as I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress early in my 20s. So pretty much my entire adult life, I've just been an adult that has managed post-traumatic stress. But that's not clinical for me. That's how I parent. That's how I am as a partner. That's just how I am as an adult. So a clinical conversation is really important in understanding my medical diagnosis, but how I balance it as a mom and as a person who maybe it affects how I sleep is way more personal and not clinical to me. Like how I inhabit my life isn't ever as a patient. Like I'm never thinking of myself as a client. I'm just thinking of myself as going through my life, and this PTSD thing affects it a lot. And so I'm figuring out how to manage that. Unless I'm in therapy, which might be an hour a week, I'm figuring that out in a very non-clinical setting. And that's where I live most of my time. But we haven't often talked about it that way, just like mom to mom. How does your PTSD show up as a parent? And that's not the language. So sometimes the language of the clinical doesn't match the experience. So it's not super helpful unless you're in that clinical setting. But like, how do I balance it in real time where I spend most of my life? And that for me, I was craving conversations that are just about how does it show up in daily life?
Right. So a couple of points you made last time we talked was that, you said it was hard to sometimes be open or honest with your therapist, almost because of this. And maybe that certain therapists out there, not all, of course, but something's missing in the conversation or the understanding. So what is it? What is it? So, before you answer, so what I'm hearing you say is that, for that hour that people are in therapy once or twice a week, there's a certain conversation going on there, which is great and necessary. But the other 99.9% of the time, they're living their lives in a different way. And another discussion, or maybe an even more important discussion, needs to happen.
Yeah, the clinical just doesn't always translate. So, and I have to say, you mentioned I'm going through cancer, and I will say it's very similar because, and this is what I mean. So when I go to the doctor's office, and I'm at the doctor's a lot, they're telling me about treatment protocols. What's the chemotherapy like? What date is the surgery? Call if you have this or that symptom. That is a very important conversation to have, and all that information is crucial. However, my experience living with cancer is very little about all that. What chemotherapy drugs I'm using, what day I'm going in, like how I'm experiencing cancer isn't ever a part of the conversation, really. It's how cancer is being treated. And I think we've come a long way with trauma now, where how we experience our trauma in our bodies, in our lives, is now part of the conversation that also is happening in a clinical setting. But that wasn't always the case. At least when I started trauma therapy, it was a recounting of traumatic events and then lots of suppositions about how that would impact my adult life. But it was less about me saying, this is how I made sense of my life, given this is my experience. It was more medical, which totally is valid and makes sense for the person, especially for a therapist. If I'm a therapist and I'm seeing 40 patients a week, I'm thinking, how do I treat this population? But for me, who is only in this seat 1 hour a week, I'm not really being able to bring in how I live all the rest of my life and saying like, I don't really need to know, for example, with cancer, I don't need to know how the chemotherapy drugs work. I want to know can I parent while I'm on them? Will I still be able to
Mm-hmm.
go to work? Will it affect my sleep? Like, I'm not so interested in the cell cycle
Mm-hmm.
and how literally it's working. I want to
Sure.
know, as it's working, can I be working?
Right.
As it's working, are my relationships working? And those are different conversations. And there wasn't always room to have those in a medical model. Sometimes you'd have to have them in a survivor support
Right.
group or a feminist group or your gal pals, or like, I think for those of us who are writers or feminists, we understood like truth telling matters. And it's not like you can't tell your therapist the truth. And I want to say, like, I just have to go back and say the first time I went to therapy, like, to be safe enough to cry and share and say the reality and truth of what's going on, like, that was life changing. So I definitely don't want to diminish that. But what I couldn't talk about was balancing daily life
Mm.
and like, how do I manage this big thing called post-traumatic stress? If a movie
Well, is this a matter of finding the right therapist? Or are you saying that there's an inherent kind of difference between the way, just because it's therapy, there's an implied conversation that's going to happen that is different from the one that you're saying needs to happen also?
Yeah, I don't think it's just the therapist. It might be. It's potential. Like, for example, my oncologist, I switched to an oncologist whose wife had cancer. And he brings her up in every session. He brings up how they lived with cancer, not just how he treats cancer. And it's kind of similar because he'll give me advice about a clinical trial. And he'll say something like, I think this is great, like, this medically promising. And then he'll say, but my wife would say, listen to your body.
Mm-hmm.
If he hadn't had that personal experience and he didn't bring it in, for me, that's really important. That works for me. That feels like we can have fuller conversations and I can bring up more. Like, and I think that does happen more in therapy. And it does happen more where the professional personal divide has been broken down. I think it's still there a little bit, but it's definitely much better. But it didn't exist at all when I was a therapist. Like, no, I think I, at the end of therapy, asked my first therapist if she was a survivor. And she did not tell me and said, you know, if it was relevant to, if you were continuing therapy, maybe we could talk about it and see how it kind of fit in. But it wasn't like, it was a thing. It was a thing. And what brought her to becoming a therapist, or like, I wanted to know how, not just how trauma was treated, but how people lived with trauma. Like, I wanted to meet people that had lived with post-traumatic stress for 30 years. And like, how did it shift over time? And like, did it get better? Was it harder? Like, I wanted and right now with chemo or cancer, like, I definitely need a doctor, but I also need to know, like, how do people manage these symptoms? And that I get from people who've had it, who've had the treatment, not who provide the treatment.
Well, what I'm getting from what you're saying in part is that, you know, and I think this is a message for all the therapists out there, is you want a friggin' human being who can connect with you and almost and just be real and share their own experience about what is going on with them and what's going on with you too. You don't want someone who's just going to like be a therapist and kind of have this client therapist dynamic be kind of tilted this way. It almost sounds like you want to reach in there and grab that therapist and go, how is this going to affect me? How am I going to live with this? You know, get out of your stupid role.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And it's funny because I was like, I'm so old. I started therapy in my 20s, but I actually brought something I went to the Cambridge Hospital. They had a victims of violence program, which is where I started therapy. And I remember I've kept it all this time, but I asked my therapist to write a prescription for hope. I was like, I just need something besides a diagnosis or a prescription. Like, I need hope. So she wrote, your symptoms are due to post-traumatic stress. With hard work, they will improve a great deal over time. I was like, I want that in writing. Like, I want to know you've seen other people improve. I don't just want the description of what PTSD is. I want like the hope stories, the after, the later. How did people make sense of it? How do people even sometimes grow? Or like that was missing. And I do think things have really changed. And I do think we have, E. Venzler and lots of people that are sharing and writing just about how it feels over time and in reflection, and how it shows up in the body, in a marriage, in a relationship, and at a workplace. But those conversations for most of my life only happened in therapy.
What is your understanding or belief about why that conversation either doesn't happen in the therapist setting or is difficult to happen? How do you make sense of that?
I mean, if we're in a client therapy relationship, it's a fee-based structure. It's hard to just be peer-to-peer in that setting. It's a very defined setting, and then there's a power differential. And I think we're taught that what side of the desk we're on really matters. And I don't think that's every therapist. I don't think that's always been true by any stretch, but it used to be, and it's not anymore because this shows like this are happening, but it used to be a therapist would say, here's what survivors are going through. There wasn't an audience where survivors are speaking like, here's what we're going through outside of a clinical setting. So I think I mentioned this on the first show, but when I went to the first trauma conference in 2014, in Boston, not one person presented as a survivor. I'm sure there was countless therapists who are actually survivors as well. Right. Nobody's speaking anchored in this position of lived expertise. I know this as a person who has lived it. It would be unimaginable to have a feminist conference led by a man. It would be, you know what I mean? We wouldn't have a conference about what it's like to live as a Black person in the United States, led by a white person who treated lots of Black people. Like, it's a very odd thing where that isn't an authority position. Owning the experience, living it, having lived it your entire life, isn't considered expertise or authority. Somebody usually is speaking for you, and at least in the past, it used to be because you were too vulnerable, or it was a confidentiality issue, so you couldn't present yourself that way. It would be too shameful to lead in this place. I mean, that's really changing and changed, but it isn't like a civil rights movement where we're representing and speaking for ourselves. We're just getting a foothold and saying, like, we can say how trauma affects us as the population affected and speak from that experience and expertise. And it's not dismissed, but it used to be dismissed. If you went to a conference as a trauma survivor, that was not considered like we're peers. That was like a little weird.
All right, folks, I want to thank my sponsor for this episode, Talkspace. We all know change is constant, but these days it feels like there's something new to grapple with every single day. We may all be adjusting to this new normal, but it's still stressful, and so it's important to talk about it and seek support. Talkspace Online Therapy is here to give you that support because we all need it right now. Match with a licensed therapist from the convenience of your device, no matter where you are. Reach out to your therapist 24/7 from phone or computer, and you'll hear back 5 days a week. 1 month on Talkspace costs about the same amount as a single in-person therapy session. But with Talkspace, you can send unlimited messages to your therapist, and they'll engage with you at least 5 days a week. That means you never have to wait to share what's on your mind. The bottom line is that we all need to talk sometimes, and Talkspace wants to give more support we deserve at a price we can afford. As a listener of the Trauma Therapist Podcast, that's you. You get $100 off your first month on Talkspace. To match with your perfect therapist, go to Talkspace.com or download the app and make sure to use the code TraumaTherapist to get $100 off your first month and show your support for this show. Once again, go to Talkspace.com and use the code TraumaTherapist. Yeah, you're bringing up a really good point here, and your use of the word power dynamic. I felt that very strongly, as someone who was seeing clients. I could certainly understand that, and it's something we talk a lot about on this podcast, about the ramifications of that relationship and how to be aware of that as a therapist, how to be aware of that power dynamic and that dynamic and what it means. And as you're talking, Cissy, I'm really getting a clearer picture of what it means from your perspective as a survivor, as someone who's experienced trauma, and is still impacted by it, to be talked at or be in a position where you're relating to someone not as a peer, and what that means. That's very powerful.
And I think for me, like the trauma lens, the best example is, I think, from when we used to say, let's put on the trauma lens, and it would often be, this is how we look at a person with trauma. So we're going to use the trauma lens, and it's going to help inform how we see something. And I used to feel like, no, the trauma lens is how I see the world, and the glasses are my trauma. So how do I see it as somebody who's seen the whole world through trauma? And who's speaking for the voice of somebody who's saying, I've seen it and felt it this way from behind the glasses, not looking at the glasses and interpreting that person. And my friend and I, there was this woman that lived on my street, and we did an interactive art exhibit on just how trauma feels to trauma survivors. And everybody took a pair of glasses and explained how trauma felt as a trauma survivor. So for some people, trauma felt like there was a gray haze on their glasses. For some people, it felt like there was nothing in the lenses. For some people, it felt like one glass was full of mud. And it was trauma survivors saying, here's how trauma feels to me in my life, and not about, and then we had that next to lists of trauma symptoms in the DSM, how I feel it. And, if that's called dissociation or depression or whatever, isn't how I feel it in my life necessarily. That wouldn't be my language until I maybe get a clinical lens. But how I experience it is just how I see the world. So it's trying to make sure we're translating back and forth to each other from these different roles, which we may be in outside of my life, outside of therapy. I may be a professional, and outside of your professional role, you may also be a client and a survivor. But how are we translating back and forth to each other to make sure that power differential is cloaked in both of our language and both of our experiences of why I'm here in this, why each of us speaking, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I was going to ask you for kind of a takeaway for all the therapists listening, but I think you said it right there. But let me kind of ask you this question. You talked a little bit about your cancer. Where are you now with it? How is it impacting you? What's going on?
I just finished chemotherapy. This is a wig, so I'm not going to do the Ayanna Presley reveal, which was beautiful to see her doing on TV and showing her alopecia from different causes. But it's interesting. I talked to somebody, and this is really hard to say, but I'm going to just be totally honest. I mean, compared to PTSD, cancer is much easier because the world, and this gives me so much hope for PTSD, the world is so kind and compassionate and responsive, and everybody shows up and everybody's helpful. It's like more of an outpouring. With trauma, it's so invisible and shameful, and people are so uncomfortable if you're going through a crisis that's related to mental health or trauma. But with cancer, I mean, everybody's so supportive, and also people just have a vocabulary and an understanding of like what that means, maybe even more than you do. But it used to be cancer was shameful. So it gives me so much hope, because I think like in 30 years, if someone says they have PTSD, I mean, I still get, it's been 5 months. I mean, I get cards every week. I get gifts. I get food. I get so much unasked for, unbelievable support. And of course that makes my journey easier, even though it may or may not cure my cancer. It still makes my journey, I'm so connected to people.
Right.
And when you're in shame, you're so isolated from people. So I get to share that easily. Everybody asks. Like it has really reminded me of, it's given me more passion to be more open about PTSD too, because it's so helpful when people share what they went through, what helped, their stories, how they've been impacted, their fears. Like you get in a bigger community, and it's powerful. It's helpful. So I feel like we'll get there with trauma, and that's my hopefulness.
Yeah. I mean, it also takes a certain amount of courage too. I think, you're stepping outside, you're sharing what's going on with you, whether it be cancer or PTSD. And I think that takes a lot of courage. And I think that resonated with me too. We're attracted to these things and other people that resonate with us for whatever reasons. And I see how people respond to you on social media, and it's very positively, and I think it's important. It's important. You're a leader, you're stepping out and you're saying, this needs to happen. This is my experience. Let's talk about this, people, let's do this.
But also I'm a writer. So honestly, it's also that, because you're just like, people are amazing. Humans are carrying amazing stories in their hearts, often secretly, often privately, and we're almost always better for hearing them.
And in a sense, when you're talking about your experience with therapists, not all therapists, but where your experience with therapy, and there's that power dynamic, and there's that differential and the difference between like the clinical, what's going on clinically and what's going on in your lived experience. It's almost as if you're saying, listen to me, hear me and my story,
Yeah. And also that, I think that's what gives me hope when I hear other people. Like, I want to know, I really am inspired when I know somebody's lived through something brutal and found a way. I mean, that inspires me. That lifts me up. That gives me hope. If it's hard to believe that if somebody hasn't been through something similar, it doesn't have to be identical, but like, that's a Sherpa who's been up that mountain. Like, that is really important to me. And it's almost unprofessional if you want to have a therapist that's like, I've been there. Like that's really awkward and hard. And I understand for good reasons, like the boundaries, but I want settings, whether it's writing groups and sharing and writing and truth telling and music and art and social media, where we're allowed to just connect as humans. That is healing. I do feel like that is very healing, and not everybody needs it. Not everybody wants to do it. Doesn't resonate for everyone. But for those of us that need to know, like, what was it like when you were there?
Right.
How did you get through it? Do you have any tips? What'd you learn?
Right.
Like some of us, that's the guy, like that's the experience we need the most.
Yeah. And also, you survived. Oh, okay. I can get through it. It's totally, it's that human, that sharing, and I may have talked about this on our first episode, but that's a lot of what this podcast is about and has become about. It's just that, it's so many clinicians who've been on this podcast who have been doing this for a long time have talked about, yes, the clinical understanding is important. Page 20 of Bessel van der Kolk's book is crucial. You have to know that. But equally, if not more important, is being able to connect and share and be in relationship, ethically and with boundaries with the person you're sitting in front of. And, that involves, and I think this is kind of getting at where it's difficult for a lot of therapists. This requires a lot of work on the therapist's part, a lot of inner work, a lot of their own exploration, a lot of looking at their own traumas. And that's not always easy, because it's like, wait a minute, you're asking me to do my own stuff. I'm just here to help you. Yep. Let's look, but that's not the way it goes.
Yep. And it can be alienating, because I think, I've loved therapy. I've used the therapy a lot. I called therapy, for the first decade of therapy, I called it paid for parenting. I was like, I pay someone to be unconditionally supportive, interested, doesn't roll their eyes when I bring up the thing again. Only parents do that. You don't get that much in your adult life. So it is a valuable, very healing, beneficial, probably helped save a lot of my other friendships and relationships, because I could just go back to the same unresolved whatever. So again, I don't want to diminish it in any way, but I also wanted to feel like I want to be able to bring my rawest self, including my post-traumatically stressed self, in all my relationships, in everything I do. It's impacted me always. It's not separate from the rest of my life. And I need to be able to talk about that conversationally. I need to be able to talk about how co-sleeping freaks me out if there's an abuse history. And I don't necessarily have to detail my abuse history. I need to figure out problem solving, like co-sleeping for me is different than it is for somebody else as a parent. But that's a different conversation, because it's really anchored in the present. I know what caused it. I've addressed what caused it, but it's still a new problem in the present, because it's affecting my parenting. And I need to be able to troubleshoot and problem solve with someone that also understands its impact of the present, not just the past, if that makes sense. And that hasn't always been easy to find.
What's your purpose when you get on like Twitter or other platforms of social media? Are you consciously saying, okay, I'm going to do this to get something out there? What is your hope for what you're doing for your mission? Because you're on a mission.
I am on a mission. And when I turned 40, I made a promise to myself. I would no longer, I used to think how I seemed was more important than how I was. You know, like if I seemed happy, if I seemed functional, if I seemed productive, if I could hide that I had PTSD, I thought that was success.
Mm.
I don't think now my passion and mission is to be totally honest. So if I'm struggling, I'm going to say it just to have the ability to be real. If I'm blissed out, I want to be able to share it. I think the range of human experiences for a lot of us who've had trauma, they've been blunted both in positive and negative. And the ability to ride that, to me, is a victory. And I feel like I know so many people that are so terrified. They're only going to feel sad if they have emotions. They're only going to feel numb or overwhelmed. And I feel like I want to say, like, it is possible to have a full life. And sometimes it's still post-traumatically stressed, but it's a great life. So I feel like I want to say that as somebody that's been through a lot, because I never had that. And that's what I wanted the most. So it's more like, again, like be the person you needed, that saying, but that really is my motivation, is like, I just want to know someone got to have a regular life, because that's what I was afraid I would have been robbed of. And I feel like I don't ever take that for granted. And I know there's people out there that, like, I have a section on my website that's called Love Notes to the Nervous System. And it's basically for people up at 3 a.m, like hobble, on their computer, looking for some sort of hope. And all those people are looking for is hope, that like, I'll get to normal. I'll get to be okay enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just, it's like, I'm going to like my life. I'm going to like myself. I'm not going to hide. And I feel like that's all I do. It's pretty much all I do. And that for me is a win. It's not for everybody, but that's what writing is about too.
Seemingly humble aspirations, but not easy at all to get there, to get to that point where, we're less concerned about how we seem than how we are or who we are. I mean, that's rock solid gold nugget piece of wisdom right there. And it's so true. All right, Cissy, how do people get in touch with you?
I mean, I'm on ACEs Connection, trying to make more voices for parenting with ACEs. So I'm on ACEs Connection. That's where I work. And my website is Heal Right Now. And it's WRITE, Heal Right Now, which honestly for ovarian cancer also, that's the goal, heal right now. And I feel like that's pretty much my life's goal: writing, being present, healing, so that's how to reach me, but that's pretty much what I'm about.
Okay. And I'll have those linked up at the show notes page at thetraumatherapistpodcast.com. But before we go, what or who are some of the things and some of the people that are inspiring you? Like when you're reading or when you're on social media or whatever, what's getting to you that you would share with us?
I love Donna Jackson Nakazawa. I love all her work on Childhood Disrupted and newly on Angel and Assassin. I love Bella Ruth Napperstack, and Have Forever. Invisible Heroes is my favorite healing book. I love all the classics. I love learning about polyvagal theory with Porges. I love all the trauma-informed regulating the classroom. Emily Reed Daniels, Hear This Now. I think you'd love her as a guest because she talks about like body-based and somatic healing.
What's her name?
Emily Reed Daniels, and her site is Hear This Now. Okay. And it's she just talks about it's really focused on teachers and students and becoming a regulated adult, so you can co-regulate with kids, whether they're your own kids or whether they're in a classroom setting. I just love fiction writers. I love truth tellers. I love social justice warriors, and there's a lot of those on social media, and we can connect internationally. So I love Bruce Perry. I'm a total fan. I like Attachment Trauma Network. I love all the work the Attachment Trauma Network does with parents and adoptive parents and trauma survivors. And I love that we're having these conversations. This jazzes me. This is exciting.
Well, you're doing it, man, and you're so inspiring, and that's why I love having you back, and we'll continue to do this. And Cissy, I want to thank you so much, and I wish you well, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much.
All right.